Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Bob Stein. I'm the director of the Institute for Entrepreneurial Excellence at the University of Pittsburgh, and welcome to our webinar this morning, COVID-19 and how it will trigger global supply chain realignment and what to do about it. I hope everybody is well and safe, and everybody's families are well. And of course, if any businesses need any assistance from the Institute for Entrepreneurial Excellence, please feel free to reach out. Our website is entrepreneur.pitt.edu. I'd like to remind everyone of an upcoming program that we have on May 19th with Cohen & Company. We are doing a webinar on the CARES Act and maximizing loan forgiveness. And we know most of our IE clients have received a PPP loan, and they all want to maximize their loan forgiveness. So that would be a great webinar to attend, and that's on May 19th. And I also like to thank our hosts and sponsor for today's program, Meyer, Unkovic, and Scott. The law firm has been a supporter of the IEE for nearly 25 years, and we're very appreciative of their ongoing support. And of course, I'd like to introduce our speakers today. Our first of which is Dennis Unkovic, of course, Meyer partner at Meyer, Unkovic, and Scott. And Meyer, Unkovic, and Scott is a law firm handling a wide variety of business transactions, corporate litigation, technology, and IP matters. Dennis has extensive experience with the inbound and outbound foreign direct investment transactions and works closely with companies, financial institutions, not-for-profits, trade associations in the U.S. and abroad. His work has taken him to more than 60 countries with a particular emphasis on the Pacific Rim. And he has a BA with distinction from the University of Virginia, but most importantly, he has received his JD from the University of Pittsburgh. Our second speaker today is David Iwinski, and he has worked in international business management in Asia and Europe for over 31 years. He's currently the managing director of Blue Water Growth, a global merger and acquisition advisory firm. And he has earned his BA in literature from Duquesne, but also, more importantly, his JD from the University of Pittsburgh. Now I'm going to hand it over to our speakers, and looking forward to a great session today.
Thank you, Bob. I appreciate the very kind introductions of David and myself. I'm going to give you a little more background in a minute, but I wanted to thank you for almost a quarter century of supporting the Institute for Entrepreneurial Excellence. Our firm believes in what you and your people do, and you're one of the great resources in our region. So thanks very much. Today, ladies and gentlemen, you're going to hear what will be an amazing story. I know a lot of you think you sort of know what has happened. I'm not sure you understand to the degree that David and I will be talking about today. Before I introduce David, a little more information on myself, let me basically tell you what we're going to do. We've taken this program, and it's not a lecture. There will be slides or PowerPoints you can look at it or not, but we're really here to have a conversation. Part one of what we're going to do is take a look at China first, beginning in late December, early January, essentially through today. We're going to explain to you in ways that I'm not sure you yet realized what happened in China and what impact that will have over the next, we think, 6 to 18 months on the global supply chain. And basically, the supply chain globally is fractured. We'll explain why. The second half of the program is you're going to say, oh my gosh, where am I? What am I going to do? We have some specific suggestions of not only what you ought to think about, but frankly, what you as companies need to do, many of you need to do in order to not necessarily survive, but to do better in the next coming months, which we think are going to get worse. We're not here to tell bad stories, but I think we're here to reflect what we understand. How do we know this? David Iwinski, who will be on in a minute, is a dear friend of mine for more than 30 years. He worked for a number of companies. He worked for Bombardier. If you've been to the airport in Frankfurt and been on the People Mover, he helped build that. If you've been on the subway in Rome, he helped build that. And he was very involved with Bombardier till he joined a company called Respironics. Respironics is one of the great Pittsburgh success stories, which started as a spin out from Westinghouse with a $10,000 investment. Respironics was sold about 5 or 6 years ago to Philips. But David lived in China and ran China operations for Respironics for 5 or 6 years. He actually, believe it or not, built a plant that we'll talk about in a few minutes in China. And that plant, 2,000 people, and they manufactured what else? Respiratory masks. After that, he went on to set up a medical transcription company with a couple of thousand employees in India called Acusis, and now is with his own company. David is like I am. We're going to give you the straight story, what we understand and what's going on. That's David. You'll hear from him from a minute. Me, I'm a partner with a law firm in Pittsburgh. We've been a longtime supporter of the IEE, and it's really great to be, here today. My first trip to China was to Hong Kong in 1985. A year later, I went to mainland China, as it was called then, or China today, and have been there about 60 times since. I am not an expert on China. I say that because I don't think anybody is really an expert on China. If you've been to China, you think you understand it, but if you go back 6 months later, it's like a different country. On the screen now are 2 books that I've written. They're not for sale, just as background. One is in Chinese and English called The Art of Investing in America, which focused on Chinese companies coming to the US. The other is called Asia Ascending, that was published by Unkovic, which is a publisher in Chicago about 2 years ago. It talks about the strategies for dealing with Asia. Now, what has happened today is that we are in a situation which began in China. Basically in China, these 8 points that are on your screen now, you don't have to read them, we'll give you the PowerPoints later, are what we're going to talk about in the next half an hour. Let's talk about where we were, where we are today, and then what we ought to do in the future. Let me take a minute and turn it over to Dave Iwinski. Good morning, Dave.
Good morning. It really is an honor to be here and speak to you folks. We're going to cover this sequence, and we just laid this out as a bit of a roadmap, a bit about the health crisis and then how China factories work. And you'll see that this becomes instrumental in understanding what happens afterwards, because it's a very unique situation. And then we had some predictions about some dominoes we thought would fall, and how when they finally got to the United States, we really had a very difficult situation that made China's side harder to deal with. And then finally some predictions, and then more importantly at the second half, the now what do we do to react to this information? So I think we'll start with the health crisis. These numbers were updated just about half an hour ago. We're all familiar at this point with information on COVID, but the current stats are 3,671,000 active cases. Total cases, 2.2 million active, and 253,000 deaths. 210 countries are affected, and to be honest, these numbers, I have to say, based on my own reading, they're understated, probably pretty dramatically. Some of it's understated because some of these countries don't have adequate testing materials or regimens to really document their number of COVID cases. And some of them are simply dramatically unreporting. China is going to be central to our discussion today, obviously, but the notion that the United States has a 10-fold infection rate and 10-fold death rate over the official numbers is just ludicrous. So there are a number of countries that are dramatically underreporting. Our expectation is that this is actually worse than it looks right now. And we'd like to talk a bit about how Chinese factories work and why the timing of Chinese New Year was so critical to all that's going to follow.
Dave, can I jump in here, because you really ran a factory. Now, if you're in Western Pennsylvania, as a lot of us are on this call, the factory's down the street. You take a car or you take public transportation, you go to work and go home. They're completely different in China. David built a factory in Dongwang, which is an area outside Shenzhen, which is about 50 miles from Hong Kong, for 2,000 people. His factory was pretty typical to what you'll see in China. You'll essentially have the factory in the middle. Obviously, we all know what a factory is, usually concrete floors, 4 or 5 stories high. But then there's a building next door, and that building next door is what? It's a dormitory. And it's not like everybody is living in their own Holiday Inn overnight room. There are bunks, 2, 3, 4, 5 in a row stacked up, and people are sleeping there. Sometimes they're sleeping there. Why? Because they sleep in shifts. There's another building in the back which has a cafeteria or a place to eat. There's another building over on the left that has maybe a healthcare facility. And then there's the always soccer field, basketball court where people are. But essentially, a factory in China is not a factory. It is a small city. And in the area where David built his factory, which is in the Pearl River Delta, which is about 90 million people, relatively near Hong Kong, if you think of southern China, in there are tens of thousands of these factories. And also, we'll talk later about factories that exist in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. Again, they follow this model. But don't think of US factory, think of the China model. Now, David, why are these factories uniquely tied to the Chinese New Year? And what does that mean?
Well, you know, you've got these people living in dormitory style, and they do this because if you look at a map, along the coast is what you would think of as rich China, wealthy China, where the factories are concentrated, technology, innovation, shipping. Inner China still has a much lower income and GDP, and so what happens is the people from the center of China all travel, or from the north to the south. So during Chinese New Year, it's the one time of year where everybody goes home. The migration is just extraordinary. And I explain it to friends in the US by saying, imagine that at Christmas, everyone east of the Mississippi goes to Los Angeles, everybody west goes to Boston. They stay a week and then they all go back. You essentially have that happening on an order of magnitude 3 to 4 times as many. 1 billion people switch places. So what this means is that during Chinese New Year, obviously everything's closed. The transit systems are jam-packed. It's astonishing, the trains and the buses and all the different ways people travel. But this year, the COVID-19, we think, was first discovered to be out and about November, maybe December. Started to have some rumblings that were pretty serious in January. But for reasons that I truly don't fathom, the government didn't impose the lockdown, the quarantines, and the restrictions until right in the middle of Chinese New Year. In my opinion, a week earlier, a week later would have been dramatically better. If you'd done it a week earlier, everybody wouldn't have gone home. They would have been locked in the factories. And if you'd done it a week later, they would have come back. But instead, they knew this infection was out. They allowed this extraordinary super concentration, hundreds of millions of people in tight proximity, traveling for long hours, and spreading the virus all over and concentrating it. And then they get locked in. And
can I add one thing here, Dave? Can I interrupt for just a minute? You're probably saying, why do these people travel the literally hundreds of millions of people around China? The answer is, in the middle of China, it's still very poor. David talked about rich China and poor China. So yeah, someone in the middle of China might make $10 a day, but on the coast in one of these factories, they can make $50 or $60 a day. So essentially they can make 5 or 6 times what they would normally make at home. So a lot of younger people, to me, everybody's young, I'm making a joke, but you know, everybody probably between the age of 18 and 30, why don't I go work somewhere, spend 3-5 years? I can save up as much money as I could if I'd ever worked back at home in central China. Turn it back to you, Dave, but that's why it's all about money.
Absolutely. They're migrating to find opportunity. And when they're in these factories, there's nothing to do but work. So they'll often accumulate overtime, additional wages. And because when I ran my factories, it's, you know, food, shelter, medical care, recreation, clothing. They really have very, very low expenses. So they can save everything. So they find themselves right in the middle of Chinese New Year, the worst week in the entire year to lock the country down. So they get thrown into quarantine. This is just a small sample of the cities that were put in quarantine. And now everybody's locked up. They're not earning money. The workers are not. The factories are empty because everyone has gone home, and now they're stuck. So after, a week, and, they thought Chinese New Year would end on February 7th, and then it was going to go to the 15th, and then it was going to go to the 22nd. People start realizing, look, I may be locked out of my factory. My factory's in Wuhan. I can't get there. Or if I'm living in Wuhan, I can't get down to Shenzhen. I need to start finding an alternate way to make money. I need to start finding a way to keep my family alive. So that leads to people seeking employment.
Now, David, every year when you ran your factory, isn't it true, Dave, that not everyone would come back? Isn't that right? So if you had 100 workers leave, you wouldn't always get 100 back. Is that right?
Yeah, you'd get 80, maybe 85%. A certain percentage, they've been living away from home for 4, 5, 6 years. This time they get home and they say, you know what, I'm staying now. I've accumulated enough savings. I can open up a shop. I can go into business. I can retire perhaps. So you always had some that didn't come back. But this year, with 780 million people under travel restrictions, people started to seek new jobs closer to home, or maybe if where they lived, let's say you lived far in central China, you couldn't travel into Wuhan. So you just went somewhere else. You went to another place and you tried to find alternate employment. And this is what created the next step in this crisis. And Dennis, do you want to jump in on this one?
Yeah. Basically, you would lose 10 to 15% of your workers every year. They wouldn't come back for the reasons David said. This year, because of it's sort of like the black swan, everything, the worst thing that could happen happened at the same time, or the perfect storm, if you saw that movie. More than half, we estimate, of the workers who were working all over China never went back. And that creates an enormous problem, because when you don't have enough workers, you want to go out and find replacement workers, but everybody else in your region is needing those workers too. So there was a tremendous, was and continues to be a tremendous scramble to find new workers. And even when you get those workers, now let me say something. I have grandkids. When they go to McDonald's and they buy a Happy Meal, there's a little toy in there, a plastic toy. They used to be made in China because you'd take 2 pieces of plastic and put them and screw them together, and there was a toy for the kids. China's not like that anymore. China does very sophisticated manufacturing, like the factory David used to run, which were making surgical masks that are plastic injection molded, very, very sophisticated, very, very high tech. And so these new workers can't just be put on the job, they have to be trained. And training a worker can take 3, 4, 5 months. And so you have a hiring crisis and a training crisis. Dave?
Yep. And so when you get to things that are even as sophisticated as iPhones and complex electronics and medical devices, the training not only takes time, but it takes a certain level of capability. So imagine now, and these numbers are based on the people that I've been talking to 3 hours a night for the past 3 months, every night on video conferences and Zoom calls to try to understand the problems, and in some cases their clients. They've now got 60, and in one case 70% of the people didn't come back. So you've got places in China, and Dennis and I have been there, you'll be on an 8-lane highway for 15 hours, horizon to horizon, nothing but factories, hundreds of thousands of factories. And now they all have to go out and hire 40 to 60% new people. Their staff didn't come back. And sometimes the trainers didn't come back. So now they don't even have anybody prepared to train the new team. And they're all doing it at exactly the same time. So they're taking kind of anybody that's got a pulse and breath. But that doesn't mean that productivity and quality can go back to pre-Chinese New Year standards. Instead, they're not fast enough, they're not good enough. It would take with no other factors in play, if this were the only problem, it would, in my estimation, take a year to 18 months plus to get back to quality levels and productivity levels that were pre-crisis. Just too many people needing too much training, and they're obviously in many cases not that skilled to begin with. So output and quality really suffers and drops dramatically. But go ahead, Dennis. Yeah.
Now, Dave, what we haven't talked about so far is money. And three things. Number one, these companies exist in China. Essentially, they get an order, they have it inspected, and they have it shipped. And when it arrives in the Long Beach Harbor or Baltimore or wherever it ends up on the ship, it gets unloaded. And when you, the customer, gets it in the US, you say, it's okay, and you wire transfer the funds to them. A lot of that essentially stopped. And so they are having really a revenue problem. Secondly, Donald Trump, David and I disagree strongly on Donald Trump. We're not going to go into that because we're both sides of the coin here. But what Trump did is he imposed strong tariffs over the last 2 years. And whether you like Trump or not, the tariffs had one major impact. They affected the profitability and sometimes even the ability of Chinese companies to survive, because most of them work on very, very thin margins. The final thing is there are several kinds of big contract manufacturers in China. I got an old iPhone 6 here that I still use. It works pretty well. There is a factory group that works with Apple in China, and they have about 500,000 to 1 million workers. No exaggeration. They're really big. They can get money. But most of the tens of thousands of companies that David and I have been talking about, they have been running essentially this close to going out of business. And what happened is, because the New Year's went from 7 days to 10 days to 12 days, and David and I would argue the New Year really isn't over yet, these companies are out of business. And so the financial position that these companies find themselves in is extraordinarily bad. They don't have working capital and they don't have liquidity. And just about the time in China when they're about to make these things and ship them over to the US, what has happened? A lot of your companies have said, look, I don't need anything now. I don't have any orders. And so there's a big financial problem in China. Dave?
So these companies that we often think of, there's a lot of images in America that because China is such a manufacturing juggernaut and they have such a huge economy, that these individual factories are flush with cash. But in reality, many of them living literally paycheck to paycheck, desperate to try to stay alive during this crisis. So they start to have shortages and finished goods and parts, and revenue and earnings start to take a dive, and product shortages. Now, Dennis and I, we spent some time on KDKA and CNBC back in February, and we were saying back then, there's going to be empty shelves. Empty shelves.
People laughed at us. They said, oh, there are not going to be any empty shelves. There'll be plenty of stuff. Well, have you been to a Walmart or a Giant Eagle recently?
Yeah, I mean, there's, and incidentally, the consumer side is just the very beginning, because in reality, a lot of American businesses that depend on China for parts and for components, well, they know Chinese New Year every year. There's a 2-week shutdown, and there's normally a week or two before and after where things are slow, prepping for the holiday and ramping up. So they'll build up some extra stock. They'll build up some inventory, but not much. And that's gone now. And so that gets us to this next part, which is China's gone through all of these things. They've had a massive health crisis, far worse than their numbers would show. And then they've got the quarantine, and that relates to employment and training, all these cascading things, which, by the way, we predicted on February 6th in a newsletter from our company. We documented all of this. Nobody believed it, but we did. And then finally, reduced earnings, liquidity. And I'll tell you, a lot of these companies barely hanging on by the tips of their fingers. And people that I work with and work for said, soon as America starts ordering in volume, and soon as we can start producing a semi-decent volume and good quality, man, we will barely survive. And just then, we all start closing down. We don't answer the phone because we're not at home. We're all sheltering. And so that really was the last straw that pushed China right off this cliff in the manufacturing world. And it's the last straw, though, of straws that have been building up for a long time. See, COVID-19 and the absolutely disastrous timing of the shutdown during Chinese New Year, this is the straw that broke the camel's back. It led to all these dominoes that we've been discussing for the past 20, 25 minutes. But this has to be set into the backdrop and the context of what's been going on in China for decades. Wages rising dramatically over those years, an enormous debt crisis, and probably limited funds for the big bailouts that we're so addicted to here. They have a housing bubble that is just unbelievable, super expensive, and that's got individuals in debt. And not because of rising wages primarily, but because of robotics and automation and factory automation, there's actually a big unemployment problem in China. Again, these kinds of things, the US press constantly reports, the powerful economic power. Well, maybe, but a lot of cracks appearing. There's internal political issues, the Tibet side, as well as the unrest in Hong Kong. Then all these regional conflicts, Spratly Islands, projection of power, a lot of frustration with Indonesians, Malaysians, and the Philippines. And then you've got regional aggressive competitors. I mean, during all this time, the Vietnamese, Malaysians, Cambodians, they've not been sitting idle. They've been studying and learning. How can we do this? How can we replicate it? And this has been happening before COVID. Our company last year moved several American firms who had been heavily invested in China. We moved them to Malaysia and Thailand because they felt that China was getting too expensive. And then you finally get these last two. In my opinion, American presidents have been pretty soft on China after Truman. And we play nice and they talk tough during the election cycle, but once they're in office, they play really nice. They buy a lot of our bonds. They're our #1 trading partner, and they're just an enormous, important part of the American fabric of our economy. But we now have a president who, for good or for ill, he's not going to play nice. And he came on aggressively. He wanted trade deals. He didn't want lip service and BS. And he instituted huge tariffs. And he essentially started a trade war. And whether you like the guy or hate the guy, the reality is he's there. And these tariffs have been really putting, an additional huge squeeze. So to set the scene, you've got all of this stuff going on for 20 years, 30 years. This has been happening since Dennis and I went in the 80s. All these trends stacking up. And then COVID and the very unfortunate timing of the quarantine and this entire tumbling down the hill. So what did we find out? We documented all these predictions in February 6th, what we thought would happen, what we predicted, and we got a lot of flack and feedback. Here's what did happen.
In the first 2 months of this year, almost 250,000 Chinese companies declared bankruptcy. Not Chapter 11 bankruptcy as we know it in the US, but essentially going out of business. But that was a statistic that Dave and I found from an internal Chinese source about 3 weeks ago, because it had simply reported in Chinese and been translated into English for a news organization what it was. But David, I think you had an interesting thing on the next slide from the South China Morning Post, which if you're in Hong Kong is the leading English newspaper in Hong Kong. And it said?
Well, I want to give a tiny bit of context. I have had people call me and say, 247,000. Well, it's a big country. There's a 1.5 billion people. Maybe this isn't such an unusual number. This number in context is 6,400% higher than the American rate of bankruptcy. 6,400% higher. And as Dennis pointed out, we thought this was a bad number until we found this. In the first quarter, 460,000 closed, went bankrupt. If there was 247 January and February, and we've been saying for months that April and May would be, March, April, May would be worse, there was literally as many closures in March as in the first 2 months. Now, by this date in May, I think that total number is probably 550 or close to 600,000 companies gone. And new firm registrations fell 30% from a year early. So they're not being replenished. This isn't creative destruction. The weak and antiquated fall off and new things spring up. This
And,
is
frankly, David, I think we need to tell them probably next that it's more than just the number of Chinese firms. The way that you judge an economy is how its GDP, its gross domestic product, rises. And in the next couple of slides, we want to get to these sort of quickly because we next want to move to what we think you ought to do. But the Chinese economy essentially has grown for 35 years, quarter after quarter after quarter. But in the first quarter of this year, as a result of the COVID-19 disaster, which really only began to manifest itself seriously in the middle of January, where did that take us, Dave?
Well, their economy shrank by 10%, and this was reported by the Chinese National Bureau of Statistics. And this is what they showed in the report. Interestingly enough, by the way, that report's always been issued in English and Chinese. This year, only in Mandarin, for obvious reasons, to make it harder to find this data. Their economy shrank by 9.8% in the first quarter alone. Again, when you think about the extraordinary numbers of bankruptcies, and now the entire economy pulling in this hard, and second quarter, this number is going to get worse. This is really an enormous cataclysm. And interestingly enough, you know, we think here in terms of consumer goods, it's the manufacturers and the components, they haven't really felt it yet. They've been working off their safety stock, but it's coming, and it's coming big. And so we've got some recommendations. We're going to go over each one of these in more detail. But those that are listening, and friends, family, companies that you work with, everybody's going to be affected by this because this is going to slam into us.
We don't think that most companies or the news networks or anybody seems to recognize this sort of tsunami that's on its way. You know, it's sort of like before a tsunami, the water goes out and then it comes in as a tsunami. The US economy, it was announced 4 days ago, I think, contracted our GDP by about 4.8% in the first quarter. You know that a lot of this really didn't start to hit us until March in a financial standpoint. So what David and I want to do in the next 20, 30 minutes, and then hopefully if you have some questions, we'll answer them, is go to the second part of this presentation. We didn't mean to go through all this to depress you. It is sort of depressing, but we wanted to put an underlying understanding of what happened in China, where is the global economy, because we think it's incumbent upon your companies or those companies that you work with to take a serious look at how you operate and at your supply chains to see what things you might do now to mitigate what we think is going to be a bad situation. So, and one other thing, this is sort of funny, I've done this in other presentations. This is my iPhone 6. It has 32 component parts. It was first made about 2016. They're newer iPhones now. It has 32 component parts that come from 11 countries. And that's excluding the plastic box that's in here now. If you lack one of those component parts, you're not going to be able to repair or replace your iPhone 6. This is the kind of problem that consumers in the US are going to face on an increasing basis. Now, Dave, let's talk about whether we think the Chinese have done a good job in reporting what's happening and what companies ought to do. Dave?
Well, our first recommendation is be pessimistic regarding forecasts of recovery. You know, it's just the nature of the governmental system there to put a happy face on everything. And look, for 35 years, they've had 7 to 11% growth every year. It's been actually a pretty happy place. But I think that party's coming to an end. And so current infection and mortality rates seem extremely optimistic. I'm helping some people do some mask importations. There was a shipment of like 32 million masks recently seized by Chinese customs. They say, well, they were inferior, we're protecting the American public. Others I've talked to said they desperately need them internally. Large segments of the population are still under quarantine. Quality and volume production are going to continue to suffer. And the notion that, like, you know, we're just one sea box away, then it's all going to be good, that's naive and foolish. Even facilities that have some workforce are having problems getting raw materials because shipping is completely tied up. The major shipping lines have not resumed full service, and the airlines are completely bogged down with protective gear, and inspection services are overwhelmed.
Give them the example of a 747. This will really underline. I think it's a great story.
So I'm working with these folks that are trying to import, you know, legitimately produced masks and gowns and protective gear and head shields. We were trying to arrange a shipment of masks, and you know, a 747 will handle about 1.5 million masks. So when I got to the logistics side, we located legitimate supply at a reasonable price. And the logistics guy said, well, the flight is going to cost you around 1.8 million. One flight, one plane, Shanghai to Frisco. And I was flabbergasted. I said, I've done global shipping for decades. He said, I could have got you that plane for 200,000 in November. Now, all that capacity is locked up. If you want some, you're buying from somebody else. They're trading at a high rate. Just like in America, big companies will buy all the concert tickets. So if you want to see the Rolling Stones, you don't pay the rack rate. You have to pay a vastly inflated rate because big ticket services buy everything, and then they jack up the prices. That's what's happening with shipping. And so the capacity has already been purchased for the next 2 months. If you want some, it's adding in America 25 to 30 cents per mask just for shipping. But then that gets us to this next issue, which is conserve capital and conserve resources. We can't emphasize enough that the Pollyanna notion that, you know, we'll be back to work mid-May, maybe June, and then a little bit of spin up time and get those supply chains flowing from China, get our components. It's not going to happen. And you don't have to have every single China supplier fail. But I mean, I would ask the people on this call, out of those 600,000, and by June, July, call it 3/4 to 1 million companies gone. Some mom and pops, some little restaurants are included, I'm sure. But some of those are probably supplying you, or they're supplying a component supplier. And as we've kind of quipped, you can build a Ferrari, but if you don't have a steering wheel, you aren't selling it. And if that little piece of plastic isn't available, you're in hot water. So get extended payment terms, seek deferments on leaseholds, really be tight with cash, because my friends, we think you're going to need it. And then that finally gets us to...
Hey, maybe I can just jump in with one example.
Sure.
A lot of your companies use or need things that are plastic injection molded. And, you know, if you have that, you essentially need a machine tool that has been created for you, that has been ground down from a large block of metal. Whether it's, going back to my iPhone here, this little plastic case that's injected molded, doesn't really matter. But in order to produce that, it will take 4 to 8 weeks to have that machine tool prepared so that you can make that part, whether it's in China or whether it's here. The problem you're going to come into is there's only so much capacity globally to do this. And a lot of these companies that David and I have been talking about that have closed or will close, a lot of your machine tools and your products are there. You think you can go in and get them? No, you can't get them. They're going to sit there. So you're going to have to make them again. And David uses this example sometimes. If somebody says, how long to make a machine tool for this plastic phone thing? He says, well, that'll be 6 to 8 weeks. And you figure, okay, I can have it in 2 months. But if they're already booked up for the next year, it'll be 6 to 8 weeks, 14 months from now. And that's the kind of problem where we think you need to, wherever you can, get the kind of safety stock David's talking about. Dave, turn it back to you.
Indeed. And so this is a time to both be thinking the short term, which is the first 2 recommendations. Conserve your capital, get safety stock if you can. Limit your shipments. If you've only got, a stock of 1 million plastic widgets that go into your device, make sure that that final device goes out to your most critical customers, because soon you may not have any for a while. But what we think is the most important recommendation comes here. There is going to be large scale, simultaneous, global supply chain realignment. I thought this would happen when Dennis and I wrote the memo back in February 6th. We thought, man, this will be catastrophic. And then it's now worse than we even predicted. And when you get 1 million companies all going out of business at once, there will be scrambles. And that's one of the reasons we do this webinar. We could have sat back and waited till July and you'd find this out on your own. But we're trying to kind of be like Paul Revere and run through and say, look, be aware, look, get fact. Because if you act now, you maybe can be the first one in line to get those molds made. If you wait until everybody else in America figures this out, and everybody in Europe too, because they're going to have the same problem, there's going to be a lot of people scrambling. So our mantra here is realign or reshore and start it now. This will not be an easy process. I believe you're going to have some significant turmoil for at least the next 24 to 36 months. And so the realignment, Dennis, you want to
Okay. It really comes in 3 parts. Number 1, if you're in China and if you have a sole supplier, no matter where in the heck they are, get at least a 2nd or 3rd source of supply in China, because you may find to your detriment that the person or company you've been working with simply isn't in business anymore. We were shocked recently with one company we talked to that had been doing business in China and had been getting from their supply chain a certain product for the last 18 years. When we asked them, how many times have you visited with your supplier in China? The answer was, oh, I never have. I just talked to them on the phone. Well, this is the time not to talk to them on the phone. So diversify in China. The second point I would make is that this isn't COVID-19. This has already been going on. But a lot of companies, and David's company has been working with them over the time, have been said, China's, for a lot of reasons, if nothing else, it's too expensive, want to go elsewhere. The big winners in the short run, we think, will be Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, the Philippines, Indonesia. These are less expensive companies where you can have your products done in the similar kind of factories that we've described there. Another place we would mention just quickly is India. India is probably not on most people's video because they're thinking, what about this? I don't really understand. Well, the answer is India, they speak English and they are now trying very hard to become a source of supply. So look at them. And then Latin America and Mexico. But realign within China at a minimum. If not, look for other sources. And as David said, this is not going to happen overnight, but you start doing it now. David?
Yeah, and part of the reason you start now is that this will be a necessary transition. Better to do it while you have alternatives than being forced into it. But we also feel that reshoring is just going to be enormous. There's lots of reasons, and again, it's not all COVID-19. In the last 2 months, and I've been in the medical device world since about '96, and a lot of people on our team at Blue Water are medical device folks. They've all been saying the same thing when I talk to them. How could this happen? How could we let this happen? How can it be that America with our ingenuity, our inventiveness, the dominating position we had last century, innovations that changed this planet. We can't get ventilators and respirators because they're not made here. We can't get masks, they're not made here. Now, some of these things we may say, well, labor cost is, going to mitigate that it moves. But a lot of these things are very sophisticated, and we can't supply ourselves. So there's national interest on critical supplies. Literally, in the last day, a very good friend of mine that works for a company here in Pittsburgh in power transmission, there was an executive order that went out about restricting purchase of transformers to the code word is foreign adversaries. That means China. They're not going to be buying transformers in America from China. They're going to be banned. But it's not just that. Robotics has made such a change in manufacturing. A lot of people sent stuff to China 20 years ago, never went back and looked. The factories, if they went back now, some of them are lights out. They're 100% robotic or 85%. And then when you get to 85% robotics, which of course, Pittsburgh is one of the global centers, cost efficiency, labor efficiency, cost of transport, all of a sudden, all these factors play in. American workers are more expensive, but they're more efficient. Their quality is generally better. And you don't have all that inventory stuck on the ocean in sea boxes. So you can build internal capacity. You can literally build up your own factories, or outsource not to Asia or to China or India, but outsource to domestic suppliers. Now, our general advice on this, and I think our last major point, is get on with it. Because in Asia, in Cambodia, in Malaysia, in India, and in America, capacity is not unlimited. And what's going to happen is a lot of people are going to wake up to this through the summer when those plastic parts never arrive, or the quality is so bad they can't use them. And they're going to say, we got to do something. But everybody in America that can produce these parts, they're going to be jammed. And if I have to say one last thing here, the silver lining for all of this is there will be, over the next 36 months, a tremendous renaissance in American manufacturing. I mean, as was said in the Great Depression, when there's blood in the streets, there's gold to be picked up. Some companies are going to be incredibly successful because they see this trend, they prep for this trend, and they are ready to pick up the slack for those million companies that went bankrupt. Those that depend on those companies that don't get on with it, they're going to have issues. And so you start with risk analysis. Where am I vulnerable in my supply chain? And it won't always be the big things. Those factories may stay in business because they're big enough to get state support. Might be just a small little thing, but you need it. And so this realignment or reshoring, that's going to be a big part of our world at this point.
Before we go to questions, I had one final comment. I was interviewed on CNBC's Power Lunch about 2 weeks ago. It's on YouTube if you're interested. But Tyler Matheson, when he was interviewing me at the end, he says, oh my gosh, we were talking about this. This is really bad news. Do you have any good news? And I said, yeah. I think the good news is that 4 or 5 years from now, the United States is going to be stronger economically then than it is now. Because a lot of the mistakes that I think American manufacturers have made by putting all of their capacity overseas because it's cheaper, financially you can show it works, are learning that, as David says, do your risk analysis. Because from a risk standpoint, where would you be today if you had more US supply rather than overseas? You'd be in a better spot. One final thing, US companies are going to become more, not less attractive to foreign companies. If any of you are in the M&A business or buying or selling your businesses or looking for partners, the US has been and will continue to be the largest single market in the world. I'm excluding the European Union because it's different, and they're going to want to be here. So I think you're going to find greater interest in IEE members and others listening to this call having the foreign companies wanting to do business with you. Well, David and I want to thank you, and we're hoping there'll be a few questions that we can answer over the next few minutes. And
there are a few that have come up. One of the first ones I'd like to address is the issue of whether this is temporary or indefinite. I would go, it's neither. It's not temporary or indefinite, it's semi-permanent. This change is going to really, the China juggernaut is going to come to a real slow. They're going to have internal problems they're going to deal with. Keep in mind, those other trends we had on the piling on, that's still happening. I mean, that didn't stop, because once COVID is eradicated or put down or quelled, all those other problems still remain. And so I think that this is going to be a dramatic change. I'll make a prediction. Years ago, you had the Italians and the Spanish were sailing around, and Marco Polo went to China, and they were dominating the planet. You had the French with the armadas, and then the British in the 1800s. Really, the sun never set on their empire, and they really were the dominant world power. America emerged as that post World War I and II, and the thought coming into this century with this was going to be the China century. I honestly think they've overplayed their hand here, and that this dramatic shift is going to reinvigorate the intensity of creativity, innovation, and passion for making things here. And I think this is going to be a second, not the same, a different American century, but very strong. And then, Dennis, there was another question that came up about the shifting from China to Mexico as a viable alternative.
Excuse me for sneezing. Mexico, because it's right next door, and because the North American Free Trade Agreement has been renegotiated by the President and the Congress to a new agreement, I think will be the biggest, most immediate beneficiary from what's going on right now. They used to have, along the border between Texas and Arizona and New Mexico, is called the maquiladoras, which was the Spanish name for the manufacturing factories that were right along the border. When the North American Free Trade Agreement came, the maquiladoras essentially went south and went all throughout Mexico. I think you're going to see, now that Mexican-U.S. relations appear to be on the mend, thank God, they're going to be the first, most obvious place where there will be reshoring to North America. Dave?
Okay. I'd like to answer a couple other questions. One that was asked is why isn't this as widespread? And I'll give you several answers. The Chinese themselves are not going to admit this. I mean, they're understating by 90% the COVID infection rate. Secondly, unless you've actually lived in China and literally lived in a factory, I mean, you may have visited a lot of times, but unless you knew the factory situation, this would not be very obvious, all these things we started talking about. And I think generally there's just not a lot of understanding about these trends coming together. Again, if you go to the Blue Water Growth website, look up our newsletters, we laid out 100% of this back on February 6th. We were widely derided as being fear-mongering, but unfortunately, with the news out of the South China Morning Post yesterday, it's coming true all too fast. I just think there isn't realization. And the people who do know about it aren't saying, because they're kind of holding their breath wanting to skate through it. Now, there was also a question about tariffs. And is it time to apply pressure, or from a humanitarian or economic standpoint, ease up? I'll just say this. I don't see this president easing up. Others might. But if anything, I suspect that the Trump administration sees this time to press their advantage. Literally, I got a call this morning at 7 a.m. from my friend who said, we're probably going to be shut down. We're going to be shut down because they're a China-owned transformer company here in Western PA, and the edict has already been signed. They have a regulatory phase to figure out the rules, but they've already decided they're not buying transformers from China-owned companies. So I think there's an argument that this would be a good time to back off. I don't see it happening. Certainly not until November, and depending who wins, certainly not after that. And there was a last question, Dennis, about—
Let me add a different view. Tariffs are a blunt instrument, and they are not really going to either help the U.S. in the short run or harm us in the short run. That's sort of a political issue, because the cost of exporting and doing supply chain work is determined by a whole bunch of factors. I do think that China's reputation has been damaged. I think it's been damaged badly. And I don't think when you see around the world how China's being viewed by a lot of other countries that it's in the US alone. They had something called the Belt and Road Initiative, where the Chinese were going to spend $1 trillion over the next 25 years to essentially build a road between China and Europe to essentially supply Europe with all it needs. I think things like the Belt and Road Initiative are going to be set back seriously. Did you have any other questions, Dave?
There was one more, which I think is a really good question. Will China consider to renegotiate phase one of their trade options? And I'll tell you, they should. Actually, in my opinion, it would be in China's best interests to stop fighting with this particular president. What you've got really now are two gigantic bulls in the world's China shop, literally. And they would be better to renegotiate so they could keep trade flowing rather than be in conflict. And I agree, Dennis, you're right. Tariffs are very blunt instruments. I ultimately prefer free trade. But the reality is, the political reality of this situation is it would be better for China to do that, to be more accommodating. And that would be, I think, a better strategy for keeping things as they are in the macro sense. That said, Xi Jinping is not a particularly compromise-oriented kind of guy. And I actually don't see that likelihood in the near future. And then there was one last question, Dennis, you might want to grab this. Would the relationship between Trump and Prime Minister Modi of India mean that this is a time for America to utilize manufacturing opportunities from the India side?
You need a quick answer, but India is pretty much known for taking telephone calls when you call and you ask for service, and some other non-manufacturing. Modi, who has been the PM for more than 5 years, has put laws into effect making it easier to invest in India, so that from an Indian standpoint, they are now essentially open for business. So I think the Modi-Trump relationship, whatever it is going to lead to a more positive business relationship. And that brings us to about the end of our hour.
Yeah, we've come
and
to the
so
end,
on behalf of David and myself, we would really like to thank the IEE, Bob Stein, and we've had great technical support from Brett Smith, who has made this particular program possible. So on behalf of myself, David, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Well, it's been a pleasure, and we hope this has been useful and somewhat enlightening. If there are any further questions, because we've come to the end of our time, email me, email Dennis. Our contact information's here. We will promise we will answer every single question that comes in. This is something we feel we want to share this information, and we really hope that it's been helpful to you and a good use of your last hour. Thank you.
Thank you.